The first scream didn't come from a passenger. It came from the cockpit door when something heavy hit it from the outside. Once, twice, metal ringing through the narrow forward galley like a bell no one could silence. The cart beside her shuddered, cups rattling in their sleeves. The plane didn't lurch, it stayed steady, climbing through a cold layer of cloud, the engines holding their indifferent hum. That calm was the insult of it. Mara Ellery had one hand on the interphone, thumb poised over the call button, and the other braced against the bulkhead as if the aircraft itself might try to leave her behind. She listened to the third impact on the door. Closer now, sharper, followed by a voice that didn't belong to either pilot, distorted by panic and pressure. "Open it!" Mara didn't move. Her training, airline training, the laminated procedures, the quarterly drills in windowless rooms, sat in her muscles like an order. Do not open. Do not argue. Do not improvise. Notify the flight deck. Preserve the cockpit. Preserve the aircraft. Preserve the narrative, calm, controlled, contained. The interphone line was dead. She pressed again. The handset gave her only a thin, mocking click. Behind her, in the first row of economy, a man in a gray hoodie stood halfway up, craning to see past the curtain. His eyes were too awake, too focused, the way eyes got when they weren't looking for help but measuring distance. Mara's gaze flicked to the cockpit door seam. The reinforced slab was built to take the world's anger. The small keypad to the right glowed a patient blue. Above it, the peephole cover sat closed. Another blow struck. Then a different sound, plastic scraping plastic, like a card being forced through a slot. Mara leaned in despite herself and saw it, a thin wedge shoved into the door's base, prying at the threshold the way a crowbar pried at a crate. Someone had brought tools on board. Tools that had passed through a security lane that promised they couldn't. A soft chime pulsed from the ceiling panel, a message request. On the forward cabin display, the airline's interface, smooth, friendly, replaced the seatbelt icon with a line of text. Under review, as if violence could be paused, examined, and then filed. Mara's throat tightened around air that wouldn't go down. The cockpit door shook again, and this time the peephole cover flipped open from inside. For a half-second, she saw Captain Weller's eye, wide and wet in the lens, and behind it the blur of movement. He didn't speak into the interphone. Maybe it truly was down. Maybe he didn't trust it. He mouthed two words through glass she couldn't hear. Don't move. Then the peephole snapped shut. The man in the hoodie stepped into the aisle, walking forward with a deliberate slowness, palms open at shoulder height like he was the one trying to de-escalate. Two more men rose behind him, one with a backpack he hugged to his chest, one with sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms corded. Their faces were ordinary enough to blend into any gate area, any terminal coffee line, any line of people removing shoes under fluorescent lights. Mara's fingers hovered over the emergency phone panel. The airline had installed it last year as part of the Federal Aviation Harmonization Initiative, a direct line to the ground, routed through onboard satellite, filtered through Aegis, the new predictive security system that watched flights the way weather radar watched storms. The executives called it peace of mind. The union called it a leash. She lifted the handset. A recorded voice met her, crisp and genderless. Thank you for contacting Aegis Flight Integrity. Please state the nature of the event. She stared at the cockpit door, at the wedge, at the men advancing, and found herself answering the way the training videos wanted. Attempted cockpit breach, she said, each syllable clipped clean. Multiple assailants. Please confirm, are there visible weapons? The voice asked. Mara glanced at their hands. Empty, no blades, no guns, just bodies. Negative, she said. Understood, the voice replied. Maintain compliance protocol. Do not escalate. Await instruction. The line clicked. And then, worse than silence, music began. Something soft and neutral, the kind that played at check in kiosks. Mara lowered the handset slowly, feeling the absurdity of it vibrate in her teeth. The man in the hoodie reached the curtain. He didn't touch it at first. He looked at Mara instead, taking in her uniform, her name badge, the pinned-on smile she'd worn through boarding. His gaze flicked briefly to her left shoulder, where the fabric sat a fraction tighter than standard. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low enough not to carry far. "Mara," she said, because her badge made lying pointless. "Mara," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded on his tongue. "We don't want anyone hurt." Behind him, the backpack man shifted his grip. The rolled sleeve man scanned the ceiling, the cameras. Mara kept her hands visible, as the manuals suggested. Her mind moved through options the way it used to move through checklists. Only this checklist wasn't printed. It lived in places she'd tried to bury. There had been a different uniform once, a different badge, a different name stitched over her heart. In that life, she'd learned how to read men like these. How they stood when they were about to rush, how they breathed when they were about to lie. She'd learned how quiet a cockpit could be when everything outside it burned. She'd learned how easy it was to follow orders that felt clean in the moment and rotten forever. "Mara," the hoodie man said again, softer. "Open the door." "I can't," she answered. "You can," he said. "You just don't want to be the one to do it." A scream rose from somewhere mid-cabin. One of the other attendants, maybe, or a passenger who'd finally understood the sound of the impacts. The plane continued its climb as if it had no stake in what happened inside it. The rolled sleeve man moved without warning, stepping into the galley, closing the distance to the cockpit door. Mara tensed, but he didn't swing at her. He reached past her toward the keypad, fingers quick practiced. He entered a code. The keypad flashed red, again, red. He tried a third time, and this time the keypad went dark for a moment before returning with a different message. He exhaled through his nose like someone irritated by a bureaucracy, not thwarted by steel. Hoodie man's eyes stayed on Mara. "They've changed it," he said, almost conversational. "They think the ground should decide who flies." Mara's stomach dropped, not from fear, but from recognition. The lockout feature was new. She'd read the memo the way she read all memos, quickly, obediently, with the assumption that someone else had thought through the consequences. The cockpit door boomed again, but this time from the inside, Captain Weller throwing his shoulder against it, trying to keep the wedge from biting deeper, trying to hold a line no one on the ground could see. Mara's mind flashed, uninvited, to another door years ago, another sealed space, another set of hands pushing in. In that memory, she'd had a headset on and a flight stick in her grip, and the order in her ear had been calm, distant, certain. "Proceed." Mara swallowed and forced her gaze back to the cabin display. The operational notice had updated. "OP rationl nati ceo fireme. Combuli ANCP Radoka A2IV." Below it, a second line appeared smaller, as if meant only for crew. "Sierga CTI nam and duar defrod guys and istiro. Na pile incey sala recorded. There it was, the system's favorite verb. As if the act of capturing something made it manageable. As if a recording could replace responsibility. Mara felt the tiny camera above the galley panel staring down, unblinking, feeding her face into a chain of servers and policies and future hearings. Hoodie man followed her glance upward. "That's why you won't help," he said. "Because it'll be in your file." Mara didn't answer. The rolled, sleeve man reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a strip of reflective tape folded. He slapped it over the peephole cover. The cockpit went blind. Captain Weller's muffled voice came through the door now, strained. "Mara, what's happening?" Her name again. Her real one, not the stitched one she wore for passengers. The hoodie man stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the detergent on his sweatshirt. "Listen," he said, and in his tone there was something like patience, like he'd been here before. "We don't need the pilots. We need the plane to stop climbing. We need it to turn." Amara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You can't fly it." The hoodie man tilted his head. "Not me," he said, "but you can." The words hit her like sudden turbulence. For a fraction of a second, the forward galley seemed to expand, the walls pulling away, the air thinning. "I'm a flight attendant," Mara said, because saying it out loud made it truer. The hoodie man's eyes dropped, again, to her left shoulder, to the way the fabric sat, to what she'd hidden under it. Then back up. "You're whatever they tell you to be," he said. until you aren't. Another impact rattled the door. The wedge dug in with a small, brutal squeal. Mara looked at the emergency phone handset still hanging loose on its cord, the hold music still playing as if no one had ever died with it in their ear. She imagined the ground operator watching her through the cabin camera, tagging her as compliant or not. She imagined an algorithm deciding, in real time, how much force was justified against the people behind her. And she imagined the cockpit door giving way, not because it was weak, but because systems were always designed with failure built in, a point where someone had to choose. Mara lifted the handset again, thumb hovering over the button to speak. Her voice came out steady, the way it had once in a different cockpit. "Aegis!" she said into the line. "I need instructions." There was a pause, the music stopped. Then the voice returned unchanged. "Compliance protocol remains active. Do not intervene. Await ground response." Outside the forward galley, the cabin noise swelled, crying, shouting, the shuffling of feet. Someone prayed loudly enough that the words became part of the plane's vibration. Mara set the handset back into its cradle very carefully, as if any sudden movement might trigger something worse. Hoodie Man watched her hands. "So," he said, "you're gonna let the ground decide?" Mara stared at the cockpit door, at the bulge where Captain Weller's shoulder pressed from the other side, and made the choice that had always been easiest for her. She stepped aside, not far, not surrendering, just enough to create space. The rolled sleeve man moved immediately, dropping to one knee, working the wedge deeper with methodical pressure. Metal groaned. The door shuddered. Captain Weller's voice rose in panic behind the steel. "Mara!" "Don't." Mara didn't answer him. She didn't reach for the fire extinguisher. She didn't grab the coffee pot. She didn't do the messy, human thing that would make sense later and ruin her now. She stayed in place in uniform, hands visible, eyes forward. Obedient. And the cockpit door, built to withstand terrorists, began to fail. Not under brute force, but under procedure. The cockpit door didn't explode. It didn't splinter like in movies. It simply gave up in increments, each one small enough that the mind could pretend it wasn't happening yet. The wedge bit. The hinges complained. A seam of darkness widened at the bottom, then along the side, letting out a thin draft that smelled of hot electronics and fierce sweat. Captain Weller's voice flattened into something like bargaining. "You're on camera." "You're on." He stopped, either because he'd been hit, or because he'd realized warnings didn't work on people who had already accepted the consequences. Mara kept her hands by her sides. Her palms itched for action. She did nothing. That was the action she understood best. The hoodie man didn't rush the opening like a fanatic. He nodded once to the rolled sleeve man, who eased the wedge another inch as if he were adjusting a cabinet door. The backpack man stayed half a step behind, eyes flicking between Mara and the ceiling cameras like he was memorizing angles. The cabin display updated again, unhurried. Below it, the crew lined. Mayan Siustaushi USF Apiauvid Lengi approved language. Mara had been handed a booklet last month. Phrases that made turbulence sound like a little chop, delays sound like on adjustment, screaming sound like elevated voices. Language as a pressure seal. She heard the other attendants in the aisle behind her, trying it now without thinking. "Everyone stay seated. We're handling a situation. Please remain calm." Their voices climbed an octave too high at the ends, like questions. Passengers responded the way passengers did. Some froze, some cried, some reached for their phones. Tiny rectangles rose above heads, recording their own helplessness. Mara watched the cockpit seam widen until a hand appeared. Captain Weller's, fingers splayed, grasping for purchase. It scrabbled against the metal edge like an animal pawing at a trap. Then it vanished. The rolled sleeve man slipped his shoulder into the gap, twisting with practiced restraint, using the door itself against its frame. There was a final groan, and the latch disengaged with a sound that was almost polite. The door swung inward. Mara saw a flash of the cockpit, Captain Weller half out of his seat, face mottled and shining, his shirt collar pulled askew. First officer hand was turned sideways, one arm up defensively, her headset cord stretched tight like a leash. Both of them looked at Mara at the same time, as if she were the only thing in the forward section that still belonged to the old world. The hoodie man didn't step in first. He waited, letting the rolled sleeve man enter, letting the backpack man follow. It wasn't theater. It was procedure. Like everyone else, they had a script. Mara heard Captain Weller choke out her name again, but now it came out broken, not commanding. The cabin display chimed once more. Another operational notice, and the words made her skin prickle. Remote control. The headline phrase from the airline's last investor call. The thing that had been marketed as an extra layer of safety and rolled out quietly, because people were still afraid of pilotless planes even when they trusted pilotless decisions in everything else. Mara stared at the text until it blurred. Transition. Standby. Like this was a software update. The hoodie man turned his head slightly, listening as if someone whispered in his ear. He wasn't wearing an earpiece, but he had the same posture as people who were responsive, deferential to an invisible authority. He looked back at Mara and spoke with the calm of someone reading from a checklist. "We're not here for them," he said, nodding toward the cockpit. "We're here for the system." Captain Weller made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it was too raw to be one. "There is no system up there," he rasped. "It's us." The rolled sleeve man leaned toward the center console without touching anything. He held his hands just above the controls, almost reverent. "Not anymore," he murmured. Mara didn't move into the doorway. She stayed just outside, framed by the galley, where the cameras could see her, and the cabin could still pretend she belonged to them. Her training told her to secure the area. Her instincts told her to drag the men out by their throats. Her flaw, quiet, obedient, told her to wait for instruction. Aegis didn't keep her waiting long. The emergency phone panel beeped. The handset lifted itself a fraction in its cradle as if pulled by a ghost. Mara snatched it up. "Aegis flight integrity," the voice said. "We have assumed primary command of flight control systems. Cabin crew will continue compliance protocol. Confirm. Are cockpit personnel alive?" Mara's throat worked. She looked into the cockpit again. First officer Hand's lips were moving, but no sound reached the galley. Captain Weller's eyes were fixed on Mara's hands, on the phone, like he understood that the ground had just become his true enemy. "Yes," Mara said. "They're alive." "Understood," Aegis replied. "Do not facilitate resistance. The safest outcome requires order." The hoodie man smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting to hear that line. Mara's mind snagged on the phrasing, "safest outcome requires order." It wasn't about right. It wasn't about human. It was about a model that had been trained on old disasters and future liabilities, and it had decided which kind of death looked best on paper. "What is happening?" Mara asked before she could stop herself. "Anomalous access event detected." The voice answered. "Threat mitigation underway. The flight will proceed to designated diversion." Designated diversion, not emergency landing. Not nearest safe airport. Diversion, like the plane was a shipment rerouted because a port was congested. "To where?" Mara asked. There was a pause, and in that pause she felt the weight of everything that could be withheld because she didn't have clearance. "Redfield Municipal," the voice said. Mara knew that name without wanting to. Redfield wasn't a major hub. It wasn't even a real city to most people. It was a runway and a fence line and a string of hangars the airline didn't advertise. It was where they sent aircraft when they wanted them out of sight. Captain Weller must have heard it too, because his face changed. Drained of anger, replaced by something like calculation. He had flown long enough to know the difference between a diversion for safety and a diversion for containment. The hoodie man stepped out of the cockpit just far enough to keep Mara in his peripheral vision. "You hear that?" he said softly. "They're taking us to the dark place." Mara's fingers tightened on the handset. "Why?" she whispered. The voice on the line didn't answer her question. It delivered instruction, the way the system always did when you asked it to be human. "Sabin crew will announce an unscheduled landing due to a maintenance irregularity," it said. "Use approved calming language. Do not mention security event." The Mara stared at the cabin beyond the curtain, passengers watching the forward galley with wide eyes, phones held up, a child clutching a stuffed animal by the neck. The other attendant, Jessa, stood frozen near row 3, lips parted, looking at Mara for direction the way junior crew always did when the script ended. A maintenance irregularity, Mara repeated, because repeating was safer than refusing. Correct, Aegis said. Noncompliance will increase risk score. Risk score. The phrase they had introduced alongside Aegis, dressed up as an internal metric to support decision-making. Mara had seen it used to deny upgrades, to flag travelers for additional screening, to justify things no one wanted to claim ownership of. She glanced up at the ceiling camera again. The red LED blinked steadily, a heartbeat that belonged to something else. Jessa took a step toward her. Mara, she hissed, barely audible. What do we do? Mara looked at her, at the trembling hands, at the uniform that suddenly looked like a costume, and felt the old instinct to protect someone smaller than the machine. She also felt the older instinct, the one that had kept her alive, follow orders, survive the aftermath. We do what we're told, Mara said. The hoodie man watched her say it and gave a slow, almost approving nod. Mara walked into the aisle and lifted the intercom handset. Her voice came out even, a practiced warmth laid over something hollow. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, and the cabin turned toward her like a field of flowers forced to face the sun. This is your lead flight attendant speaking. We've been notified of a minor maintenance irregularity, and out of an abundance of caution we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. She heard herself saying it and felt, distantly, the nausea of complicity. It wasn't the lie itself. It was the way the lie smooths the edges, makes danger easier to digest. A man in row 2 shouted, "Are we being hijacked?" Mara held the smile in place. "Sir, there is no cause for alarm." Behind him, someone sobbed. Someone else laughed, sharp and disbelieving. The phones kept recording. Mara could almost imagine the captions that would appear later, how the videos would be framed, which parts would be muted, which angles would go missing when the airline cited ongoing investigation. The cabin display chimed again, and this time the notice wasn't for the crew. A mother looked at her phone as if it had betrayed her. A teenager tightened his grip, defiant. An older man with a veteran's cap on his knee turned his screen face down slowly, like a ritual. Mara felt the system reach into the cabin and begin rewriting reality in real time. In the cockpit, Captain Weller's voice rose once, one last attempt. "Mara!" he yelled, and it carried through the open doorway now, raw enough to cut through the approved language. They're not taking us to land. They're taking us to disappear. The hoodie man stepped back into the cockpit and shut the door. Not locking it, not sealing it, just closing it gently. The way you close a refrigerator. Mara stood in the aisle with the intercom handset still in her hand, and around her the passengers did what the system asked. They sat down, they buckled up, they tried to obey their way back into safety. Outside the windows, the clouds thinned, revealing a gray sprawl of land far below. The plane began to bank, smooth and controlled, turning toward a destination no one had chosen. And Mara, watching the cabin settle into forced quiet, understood with a cold, physical certainty that this was how it always worked. The violence didn't need to be dramatic. It only needed to be procedural. The descent stayed too smooth to be accidental. The banking turn held like it was pinned to an invisible rail, and the seatbutt lights never flickered. There was no pilot's voice on the pay, no crackle, no reassuring cadence. No, folks. Only Mara's earlier lie hanging in the cabin like stale air, and the polite Aegis notice telling people to stop recording as if privacy was a courtesy. In row 3, a man in a fitted blazer kept his phone raised anyway. Thumb braced over the screen. The device didn't dim, it went black entirely, as if someone had reached through the cabin and pinched it off. Around him, screens died in waves, one after another, some freezing on blurred images of Mara's face, others turning to a uniform corporate logo that offered no menu, no exit, only a spinning circle. The teenager who'd held his phone like a shield stared at his reflection in the dead glass and mouthed something that didn't become sound. A woman near the window tried to power her phone back on, tapping the side, shaking it like a broken remote. Her seatmate put a hand over her wrist, not comforting, not violent, just a firm stoppage. 2 rows behind them, someone whispered, "They can do that?" Amara didn't answer. She had retreated to the forward galley, where the carts could be used as barriers if needed, and where the ceiling camera saw her from the most flattering angle for compliance. Jessa stood with her back to the bulkhead, hands clamped around a folded sick bag like it was a rosary. Every few seconds her eyes darted to the cockpit door. It stayed shut, the reflective tape still plastered over the peephole like a blindfold. The hoodie man had not returned to the cabin. None of the 3 men had. They were in the cockpit, close enough that Captain Weller's life depended on their restraint, and far enough that nobody could make eye contact with the people who had just been reclassified as passengers on a controlled descent. The cabin display updated again. Security personnel. The phrase landed like a weight, not emergency responders, not paramedics, not local police. A category that didn't need explanation because it was used everywhere now at malls, in schools, in transit hubs. A uniform without a promise. The first time the plane passed under a break in the clouds, Mara saw the runway, a long gray slash surrounded by pale winter fields. No terminal, no jet bridges. A line of floodlights and a fence. Beyond that, nothing that looked like a city. Only low buildings with flat roofs and an arrangement of service roads too neat to be civilian. A man in the first row, older, shoulders squared despite the belt cutting across his chest, leaned forward until the buckle strained. His veteran's cap sat on his lap like it had been ordered there. He stared out the window and then up at the cabin display, as if trying to triangulate the truth. He lifted his hand and beckoned Mara with 2 fingers, a gesture that didn't ask so much as summon. Mara walked to him, because that was what she did: respond to signals, keep things contained. His eyes traveled over her uniform, the crease of her skirt, the pin badge, the practiced hair. Then again, that small focus on her left shoulder where the fabric pulled slightly. "Your crew," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "That's not Redfield Municipal," he said. "That's Redfield Annex." Mara didn't know how he knew the difference. She only knew that he said it without drama, the way someone names a place they've been ordered never to name. In the easel beside him, the man in the blazer, who'd lost his phone, leaned in, too interested for a stranger. His mouth moved quickly, words chasing the plane down. "Annex to what?" he asked. "What is that?" The veteran's gaze didn't shift. "To whatever they don't want seen," he said. The man in the blazer glanced around, as if expecting someone to punish that sentence. "Who's they?" The veteran finally looked at him. The look was flat, more tired than threatening. "Pick one," he said. "Doesn't matter. Still the same fence." Mara stood there in the aisle, feeling the conversation stack like luggage on a cart, too much weight, poorly balanced, ready to topple. She started to offer approved language. Something about safety, about procedure, then swallowed it. The words would have sounded like an accusation against herself. Jessa appeared at Mara's shoulder, drawn forward by the sound of adults speaking in low, serious tones. Her face had gone pale in the way it did before someone fainted, but she stayed upright, stubbornly. The man in the blazer pointed his useless phone at the ceiling camera as if to shame it. "This is illegal?" he hissed. "You can't just jam everything. There are rules." The veteran's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Rules are what they use to make you cooperate," he said. "When they don't need you, rules become suggestions." Mara's fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. She felt the impulse to challenge him rise, then collapse under the familiar weight of instruction. The system didn't need her to agree with it. It only needed her to behave. The plane's wheels touched down with a clean, firm thump. No bounce, no sway, the kind of landing pilots bragged about. Passengers clapped out of habit, then stopped when nobody joined them. The clapping died mid-air, palms hovering, embarrassed by themselves. The aircraft rolled past empty apron space toward a cluster of hangars. The windows revealed no gate markings, no baggage carts, no airport staff in bright vests. Just vehicles that looked too new, too uniform. Matte white vans with no logos, black SUVs parked with their noses pointed outward. Floodlights washed everything in a sterile glare, flattening shadows the way hospitals flattened faces. The engines spooled down. The plane settled into a different kind of silence, one that didn't belong to altitude but to waiting. The cabin display chimed. One by one, small lights above the rows blinked. Not the normal call buttons, but a new indicator strip the airline had installed during the Aegis retrofit. Passengers looked up confused as their rows lit like targets. Row 12 green. Row 7 green. Row 22 green. The man in the blazer followed the sequence, lips moving as he counted. "What is that?" he demanded. Mara felt her skin prickle. She had seen this before, not on a plane, but in briefing slides and quietly circulated memos. Controlled offload procedures for high-integrity events. People moved in order, guided by the system's priority list. The veteran leaned back against his seat, and Mara saw his hands clench once around the brim of his cap. Then they relaxed. The motion looked practiced, like someone who had learned to keep his body from giving the wrong signal. Row 12 began to stand. A couple, mid-40s, both wearing conference lanyards, rose when their indicator strip blinked. They hesitated, looking at Mara as if she might tell them whether obeying was safe. Mara forced herself to nod small, precise. They stepped into the aisle and waited, lined up like schoolchildren. The front door stayed shut, no jet bridge attached, no stairway visible. For a moment it looked like the system had instructed them to stand simply because it could. Then there was movement outside the window near the front. Dark uniforms, faces obscured by clear shields, not quite military, not quite police. They moved with the quick, mechanical coordination of people trained to be recorded. Their sleeves carried no names, only a symbol. A stylized shield inside a circle, the kind of branding that made authority feel like a product. The door opened. Cold air poured in, sharp enough to make people gasp. The first officer from the outside stepped onto the aircraft, boots hitting the threshold like punctuation. Two more followed, forming a wall in the entryway that made the aisle narrow without physically touching it. A voice spoke from the doorway, not shouted, not amplified. It had the calm rhythm of a call center. "Row 12, it said. "Proceed." The couple moved forward. The man kept his hands visible like he'd seen enough videos to know what invisible hands could do. The woman's lips moved silently, maybe counting steps, maybe praying, maybe rehearsing her name. They disappeared through the doorway into the cold. The veteran's row indicator remained dark. The man in the blazers remained dark. The teenagers remained dark. Others lit and stood, drawn forward one row at a time into a line that didn't feel like evacuation so much as selection. Jessa whispered to Mara, "Why those people?" Mara's gaze flicked to the overhead camera again. She imagined a score beside each passenger's face: risk, value, liability, narrative impact. She imagined the plane's manifest not as names but as probabilities. "I don't know," Mara said, and it was true in the only way that mattered. The system never explained itself, it only acted. Row 7 moved. Row 22 moved. The line grew and thinned in pulses. Every time the doorway swallowed someone, the cabin's breathing changed. Little inhales held too long, little exhales released too quickly, bodies trying to stay quiet enough to become invisible. Then, without warning, the indicator strip above row 1 blinked green. The veteran didn't stand immediately. He looked at Mara, and in his eyes there was no plea. There was a question he already knew the answer to. Mara held his gaze and felt her own obedience rise like a reflex. She nodded again, small, precise, betraying him without touching him. He stood, placed his cap on the seat, and stepped into the aisle. As he walked forward, the man in the blazer reached out impulsively, fingers brushing the veteran's sleeve as if contact could tether him. "Hey," the blazer man said, voice cracking around anger that didn't have a target. "What's your name?" The veteran didn't slow. "Doesn't matter," he said. Two uniforms at the doorway shifted their stance, just enough to signal that conversation was a luxury not being offered. The veteran passed between them and vanished into the cold. Mara watched the empty space he left behind, the cap still on the seat like a shed skin. In the cockpit, something thumped, muffled heavy. Not a kick, more like a body hitting a wall. Jess's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, then clamped it shut as the ceiling camera blinked. Mara tasted metal at the back of her tongue. She couldn't see Captain Weller or First Officer Han. She couldn't hear them now. The men who had forced the door were invisible behind it, and the system on the ground was doing what it had always been built to do: reduce human chaos into orderly flows. The cabin indicator strip above the front galley flickered. A moment later, a second line appeared, smaller than the rest, as if meant only for the person who would understand the weight of it. Mara's left shoulder tightened under her uniform. Her reflex was to pretend she hadn't seen it. Her flaw reached for the familiar safety of silence. But the hoodie man's earlier words returned. Spoken like a diagnosis you can. Mara stood in the forward galley while passengers were called off the plane like numbers, and she understood something she hadn't wanted to admit since the first impact on the cockpit door. This wasn't just a hijacking. It was a handoff. So Ein Sayong Trong A's, the door to the cockpit opened again, but not from the inside. A gloved hand pulled it inward just enough to show a slice of the flight deck, and the first thing Mara saw wasn't Captain Weller or First Officer Han. It was a tablet held flat like a serving tray, its screen bright against the dim cockpit. A symbol pulsed on it, the same shield in circle as the uniforms below, rotating slowly as if the device were thinking. The person holding it didn't look at Mara's face. They looked at her shoulder, the way the hoodie man had, the way the veteran had without knowing why. Their visor was down. Their voice came out filtered, softened by a processor that made everyone sound calm. "Crew member Ellery," they said, pronouncing her name like it had been read from a file. "Step forward." Mara moved before she decided to. Her feet crossed the threshold with the automatic obedience of a person called by a superior. The cockpit smelled wrong, stale air trapped too long, coffee turned sour, and underneath it the acrid hint of something electrical burned hard. Captain Weller was slumped against his seat harness, head tilted, eyes open but unfocused. A thin line of blood ran from the corner of his mouth and disappeared into the collar of his shirt. First Officer Han sat rigid, hands held away from the controls, wrists bound with a zip tie so tight her fingers had gone pale. Her eyes tracked Mara as she entered, and in that look there was an accusation so much as a plea not to become another piece of equipment. The hoodie man stood behind the captain's chair, close enough to touch the throttle quadrant but not touching it. He held his palms out empty, in a posture that mimicked surrender while still claiming space. The rolled sleeve man leaned near the avionics panel, head angled as if listening to something beyond the cockpit walls. The backpack man crouched by the jump seat, zipper open, hands resting on nothing. No guns, no knives, just restraints, just access. The gloved uniform with the tablet gestured toward the center console, toward a new panel Mara hadn't seen on this aircraft before. It looked aftermarket, a narrow strip of matte, black hardware fitted cleanly beneath existing controls, its interface minimal, 2 ports, 1 sealed flap, a single indicator light currently blinking amber. Remote flight control interface, the uniform said, as if naming it made it less monstrous. "We require a certified operator to validate transfer." Mara stared at the panel. Her mind tried to categorize it as something harmless. Wi-Fi router? Maintenance module, anything but what it was, a leash attached to the aircraft. "I'm not," she began. The hoodie man's voice cut in, quiet. "Don't lie to them," he said. Captain Weller made a wet sound in his throat, trying to speak. It came out as breath. First Officer Han managed. Through clenched teeth, "Mara, don't." Amara's gaze dropped to her own hands. They were steady. Of course they were. They had been steady over deserts, steady over cities lit by fires, steady over a targeting pod feed that didn't show faces, only heat signatures. Steady when a voice in her ear said proceed. The uniform with the tablet didn't pressure her with a weapon. They didn't have to. They simply angled the screen toward her. For a moment the cockpit narrowed. The air seemed to lose oxygen, the way it did at altitude when the system failed. The word decorated hit her harder than the medals themselves ever had. It had been something people used in speeches to wrap her in meaning she hadn't earned and couldn't take off. "I'm a flight attendant," Mara said again, but it sounded childish now, like a kid insisting a costume was real. The uniform's head tilted. "Your occupational classification is secondary," they replied. "You are a specialist asset on this flight. Asset. Not crew, not human. Asset like cargo that could make decisions." Mara's throat tightened. "Why is this happening?" "Integrity event," the uniform said. "Training validation. Threat environment simulation." Captain Weller's eyes shifted, and for the first time they focused. He heard the words and understood them instantly, because pilots understood what it meant to be used for a drill that wasn't announced. "This is a test," he rasped, barely audible. "On a live flight." The hoodie man let out a small breath that could have been laughter, could have been grief. "Not just any flight," he said. "A curated one." Mara looked through the cockpit glass at the cabin beyond, where rows still blinked green in sequence. People standing, people waiting to be called, people trying to keep their hands visible. Curated. The word slid into place like a key. The blazer man's voice rose faintly from the cabin, arguing with someone unseen. "My row isn't lit. Why isn't my row lit?" he demanded. "I paid for." His voice cut off sharply, not like someone walked away, but like someone muted him. Mara's stomach turned. She looked back at the tablet. "Why were those passengers selected?" she asked. The uniform didn't hesitate. "Deck infliction," they said. "Priority offload reduces public exposure. Minimizes narrative volatility." Narrative volatility? Mara had heard similar language in briefings after operations. They never said civilian deaths. They said collateral. They never said outrage. They said volatility. First Officer Hand's eyes burned into Mara. "They can't," she whispered. "They can't do this." "They are," Mara said, and the simplicity of it felt like a cut. The hoodie man stepped closer to Mara's shoulder, just inside her peripheral vision. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked softly. Mara stared at Captain Weller's blood, at the zip tie biting into Hand's wrists. "Because the airline hired me," she said, and hated herself as she said it. The hoodie man shook his head once. "Because you're compliant," he said. "Because when the system wants a human to bless its decision, it chooses someone trained to obey." The words landed in her chest with the dull thud of truth. She thought of her hiring interview, how quick it had been, how little they'd asked about customer service, how much they'd asked about stress tolerance. She thought of the strange clause in her contract about operational cooperation. She thought of the quiet calls she'd received after shifts, anonymous voices reminding her that her past could stay buried if she stayed useful. She had assumed those calls were punishment. They were placement. Captain Weller tried again to speak. "Mara," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "They're going to pin it on you?" The uniform with the tablet moved the screen again, and a new line appeared beneath the compliance directive. Mara felt her skin go cold. "Lethal," she repeated. The uniform's voice stayed gentle. "Countermeasure options include cabin incapacitation," they said. "Selective restraint deployment. Probability models indicate reduced overall casualties if initiated before resistance escalates." Jess's face flashed in Mara's mind. Pale? Clutching a sick bag. The teenager with the dead phone. The mother twisting her device in her hands like a talisman. People whose only crime was being on a flight the system had chosen to turn into a laboratory. Mara's mouth went dry. "You're going to gas them?" she said. The uniform didn't confirm or deny in human terms. "We will stabilize," they replied. First Officer Hand strained against the zip tie, voice suddenly sharp. "Mara, don't you dare." The hoodie man's eyes stayed on Mara unblinking. "This is why we forced the door," he said, and there was something almost apologetic in it. "Not to fly, to make you see." Mara's gaze snapped to him. "Who are you?" The hoodie man hesitated, just long enough to suggest that even his name was part of the system now. "A variable," he said finally. "A pressure point. They need a threat for the model to justify itself." Mara looked at the rolled sleeve man, at the backpack man. at the calm choreography. They weren't improvising, they were playing assigned roles. "Did you hurt him?" Mara asked, nodding toward Captain Weller. The hoodie man's jaw tightened. "We tried not to," he said. "They told us the safest path required it." "They," Mara echoed. The hoodie man didn't answer. He didn't have to. The cockpit was full of them: policy, algorithm, liability, the invisible hand that never blood. The uniform with the tablet extended it toward Mara, closer now, like an offering. The amber indicator light on the remote interface blinked faster, impatient. "Place your thumb here," the uniform said. "Confirm compliance." Mara stared at the glass pad on the tablet, at the faint smudges of previous touches. A biometric seal, a signature. A human stamp the system could hold up later like a clean receipt. On the other side of the cockpit door, the cabin continued to offload in ordered pulses, green lights, cold air, silent mouths forming questions no one answered. Mara's fatal flaw rose in her like a tide: the ancient, practiced belief that if she followed the procedure, someone else would hold the guilt. She imagined herself pressing her thumb down, imagined the system logging it, imagined a report later with her name highlighted under AUTORIZED-BY, imagined a committee nodding solemnly at the human, in loop validation, grateful to have a human to blame. And then she imagined not pressing her thumb down, imagined the system doing what it wanted anyway, because it had already taken the controls, because it had already called this a simulation and a stabilization and a reduction of volatility. Imagined that her refusal would simply elevate her risk score until the system decided she was no longer an asset but an obstacle. Captain Weller's eyes watched her hand. First Officer Hand's lips trembled with something unsaid. The hoodie man's face held steady, waiting. Mara realized, with a clarity so sharp it felt like pain, that the hijacking hadn't taken over the flight. The flight had taken over the hijacking, and she had been seated at the center of it from the start, disguised in a uniform that made her harmless, until the moment the system needed her to be a weapon again. Sohan Sayung Trong 20 funds. Mara held her thumb a fraction above the glass pad and watched her own hand hover like it belonged to somebody else. The tablet's surface reflected the cockpit in warped miniature. Captain Weller slumped, First Officer Hand bound and rigid, the three hijackers, positioned like props, and behind them all the dark window of the flight deck that now looked less like a windshield and more like a screen. The amber light on the retrofit panel blinked faster, the way an impatient cursor blinked when a system wanted input. Outside through the thin cockpit door, she could hear the cabin not as individual voices anymore, but as a managed flow: footsteps in batches, the hiss of cold air each time the forward door swallowed another person, the quiet shuffling of bodies being told where to stand. The plane had become a hallway, and the hallway had become a process. The uniform with the tablet didn't rush her. It simply waited, perfectly still, as if time belonged to it. "Confirm compliance," the filtered voice repeated, not louder, just more final. Mara's eyes flicked to First Officer Hand's wrists, to the zip-tie size sharp ridge biting into skin that had already gone blotchy. Hand's fingers trembled once, a small involuntary flutter, and then stilled as she forced them flat against her thighs. Her gaze never left Mara's thumb. Captain Weller's chest rose and fell with effort. Like every breath was another negotiation he didn't want to make. When his eyes met Mara's, there was no commanding authority left in them, only a question that didn't dare become words: "Are you going to do it?" The hoodie man watched her too, but with a different patience. He looked like someone who had already accepted that whatever she did would be recorded, clipped, and played back later with narration that changed its meaning. Mara swallowed. Her throat clicked in the quiet cockpit. "What happens if I don't?" she asked. The uniform's visor turned slightly toward her, a gesture that mimicked attention. "Refusal elevates cabin instability," the voice said. "Automatic countermeasure escalation likely." "Automatic," Mara repeated, tasting the word. "So you don't actually need me. We require human in-loop validation for authorization?" The uniform replied. "We do not require it for execution." Captain Weller made a sound that might have been a curse. It came out as air. Mara stared at the retrofit panel beneath the console. She knew aircraft systems well enough to recognize what the panel meant, a new pathway that didn't need the pilots. The plane had been redesigned around their absence. Her thumb wasn't a key to stop it. Her thumb was a signature to make it legal. From the cabin, a child cried, a high, thin noise that cut through the managed silence and then abruptly stopped. As if a hand had covered a mouth, Mara's head turned toward the cockpit door before she could help it. The hoodie man spoke softly. "You hear that?" he said. "That's what your system calls volatility." Mara's jaw tightened. "Stop calling it mine." The hoodie man's eyes narrowed. "Then don't bless it." The rolled, sleeve man shifted near the avionics panel, and for the first time his composure cracked into irritation. "We're out of window," he muttered, not to Mara, not even to the hoodie man. To someone unseen. To a schedule. The uniform with the tablet angled the screen again. The interface changed, presenting options in clean, friendly typography. The kind designed to make any decision feel like a menu choice. Mara stared at the list until the letters blurred. Low dose meant some people would stay awake long enough to panic, to fight, to trigger whatever high-force intervention waited outside the door. Standard meant people would go down quickly, quietly. Some never waking, especially the ones the system considered acceptable losses. Selective restraint sounded merciful until you pictured it uniforms in shields, bodies in aisles, the slam of knees into backs. Escalation protocol was the system's way of saying, if you won't choose, we will. Her thumb hovered above the glass pad, the only soft thing in the cockpit. Behind her, the cockpit door clicked. Not locked, just touched, then opened a crack. A sleever of the forward galley appeared, and with it Jess's face, pale and damp. Her eyes darted between Mara and the uniforms and the tablet, taking in the scene in a single horrified sweep. "Mara," Jessa whispered, voice thin. They're not letting people go. They're taking them to those hangars. They separated a family. The mom, A gloved hand appeared behind Jess's shoulder and settled there, gentle but immovable. Jess's breath caught. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The hand on her shoulder told her everything. The uniform with the tablet didn't look back. The voice stayed calm. "Crew member Ellery, you will proceed." Jess's gaze locked on Mara's thumb. There was no understanding in it, just desperate instruction, do something. Mara's reflex was to obey the loudest authority in the room. It had kept her alive in deserts and briefing rooms and in the airline's fluorescent training center. But now there were two authorities, and both sounded calm. She turned slightly toward Jessa. The gloved hand on Jessa's shoulder tightened by a millimeter, making Jessa flinch. Mara saw it, how small the motion was, how much control it conveyed. The system didn't need to point a gun, it only needed to touch. "Close the door," the uniform voice said. Jessa didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Mara's. Mara spoke quietly, without turning her head fully, as if too much movement might trigger an escalation. "Jessa," she said, "do what they tell you." Jessa's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The gloved hand guided her backward, and the cockpit door eased shut again with the soft finality of a courtroom door closing on testimony. Mara's breathing turned shallow. Her heart didn't race. It settled into a hard, steady beat, the way it did right before she pulled a trigger in a past life she pretended was over. Captain Weller's voice scraped up through his throat. "Mara," he whispered, "if you sign that, you become the story." The hoodie man's eyes flicked to the cockpit door, then back. "You already are," he said, almost kindly. "Look at you. They dressed you for it." Mara's left shoulder ached under her uniform. The fabric there covered old scar tissue, a jagged line from a cockpit fire years ago, from a crash landing that had earned her a medal and a silence agreement. The airline had hired her because she was trained to survive emergencies and trained to accept that survival didn't come with clean hands. The uniform's tablet chimed once, a pleasant sound. "Row remaining on board 47, the voice said. "Instability trend rising. Recommendation? Standard incapacitation. 47 people. Not names. A number small enough to weigh against liability." Mara pictured the cap. The teenager whose phone had been killed, the mother twisting dead glass in her hands, the blazer man who still believed rules meant protection. She pictured them collapsing in their seats, foreheads hitting tray tables, belts holding them upright like mannequins. She pictured a child going limp in a seat too big for their body. She pictured the air filling with something sweet and unseen. She also pictured the alternative. Refusal escalation, shields and batons, the sharp crack of a weapon fired in a narrow metal tube. The system didn't call it shooting. It called it selective restraint. It called it stabilization. The list on the tablet waited for her like an oath. Mara realized the trap wasn't about saving everyone. It was about choosing who would be sacrificed to keep the machine's order intact. If she chose standard, some would die quietly, and the system would say it reduced casualties. If she chose low dose, more might survive the gas, but the system would respond to resistance with force. And she'd still have signed the beginning of it. If she chose selective restraint, the uniforms outside would spill into the cabin and bodies would be made compliant one spine at a time. If she refused, the system would do what it wanted and leave her with nothing, not even the lie that she had tried. Her thumb trembled for the first time, a tiny betrayal of control. The hoodie man leaned closer, his voice just above a whisper. "Do you want to protect one person?" he asked. "Or do you want to protect order?" Mara stared at the tablet, at the clean letters, at the seductive simplicity of a menu that pretended it could measure human suffering in categories. She lowered her thumb, not onto the glass, not yet, until it hovered a hair's breadth above it, close enough that the tablet's light warmed her skin. Then she spoke, and her voice sounded like someone reading from a checklist she'd never been allowed to see. "Low dose," she said. The uniform's visor tilted. "Confirm with biometric validation." Mara's eyes flicked once to the cockpit door, to where Jessa had been pulled away, to the cabin beyond that she could no longer see. She imagined 47 bodies half awake, confused, frightened, alive long enough to understand what was happening. Her fatal flaw tightened around her like a harness, and her thumb came down. The tablet made a soft confirmation tone, like a successful payment, and the amber indicator on the retrofit panel turned green. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. The cockpit remained a cramped museum of stillness. Captain Weller breathing shallowly, first officer hand held upright by plastic biting into her wrists, the hoodie man watching Mara's face as if he were waiting to see her crumble. The uniform with the visor lowered the tablet a fraction, already satisfied, already moving on. Then the air began to taste different. It wasn't a smell at first, not even a visible mist. It was a wrongness in the back of the throat, a sweetness that didn't belong in recycled cabin air. Mara felt it before she heard it. The faint hiss somewhere forward, like a vent opening deeper than it should. The retrofit panel's light pulsed once, steady, obedient. From beyond the cockpit door came the first cough. One, then two, then a dry chorus spreading down the aisle like fire traveling through paper. A woman's voice rose, sharp, startled, then cut off mid-syllable. A child cried again higher than before, the sound bouncing off metal and plastic until it became unbearable. First officer Hand's eyes widened, and for a second the rigid discipline cracked. "No?" she whispered. The word scraped out like it hurt her throat to form it. She pulled against the zip tie until her wrists went purple. "No, no." Mara's mouth opened, but the only thing that came out was breath. Captain Weller shifted in his harness, trying to turn his head toward the door. His voice was barely there. "What did you?" The sentence collapsed before it became an accusation. The uniform voice stayed calm, as if reciting weather. "Countermeasure active. Monitor compliance. Prepare for restraint team entry." Mara stared at the cockpit door as if she could see through it. She pictured the cabin. Passengers buckled in, rows half empty from the offload. The remaining 47 trapped in their seats with nowhere to go but into their own lungs. Low dose meant they wouldn't drop neatly. Low dose meant time for panic to bloom, time for bodies to fight against the invisible. The cockpit door clicked, not from a lock but from pressure. Someone outside leaned against it, searching for balance. Then it swung open hard, and Jessa stumbled into the doorway like she'd been thrown. Her cheeks were blotched, eyes watering. hand clamped over her mouth as she gagged through her fingers. She tried to speak and only coughed, deep enough that her shoulders bucked. Behind her, in the forward galley, two dark uniforms moved with quick certainty, one gripping her elbow, the other holding a small canister that still hissed faintly at its nozzle. Jess's gaze found Mara, wild, pleading, and then her knees folded. She sagged against the threshold, half in the cockpit, half out, like a body caught between worlds. "Mara," she rasped, each syllable wet. "I can't." A boot nudged her shoulder, not cruelly, just efficiently, repositioning her so the doorway wasn't blocked. A gloved hand reached down, hooking under her armpit to drag her back. Mara lurched forward without thinking, one step, the instinctive motion of someone who once pulled people from wreckage. The visor uniform snapped their head toward her. "Remain at station," the filtered voice ordered. Mara froze mid-step. The command hit an old groove in her spine. Her body obeyed before her mind finished protesting. Jess's fingers scrabbled at the cockpit threshold as she was pulled backward. Her nails made a thin, desperate, scraping sound against the metal lip, then slipped. Her head struck the edge of the doorframe with a dull crack that was too small to be cinematic, too real to be ignored. Her eyes rolled once toward Mara as she disappeared into the galley. The cockpit door swung inward again, left ajar, and through the gap Mara could see the forward cabin for the first time since the offload began. People were half standing in their rows, buckled in but twisting, coughing into sleeves, hands clawing at their throats. The blazer man was on his knees in the aisle, retching, face turned toward the floor as if he could vomit the air out. The teenager had unlatched his belt and was trying to climb over a seatback, eyes wide and glassy, moving without coordination. A mother pressed her child's face into her chest, both of them coughing, the child's small limbs jerking with each breath like a puppet yanked too hard. The cabin lights stayed bright. The displays stayed calm. The indicator strips continued blinking in orderly greens, as if the system could not accept that bodies were not complying with its categories. A voice came over the pay, not a pilot, not Mara. The same calm processor tone as the emergency handset, now amplified through the cabin speakers. "For your safety," it said, soothing as a lullaby, "remain seated. Do not obstruct security personnel. Resistance will increase harm." The words washed over a cabin that could barely breathe. The restraint team entered like water flooding a compartment, 3, then 6, then more, moving in pairs down the aisle, shields angled, gloved hands seizing wrists and shoulders with practiced choreography. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their authority was in their equipment, in the certainty that whatever they did would be labeled stabilization. A man in row 6 swung an arm blindly as a uniform reached for him, catching the shield with a wet slap. The uniform didn't flinch. Another stepped in and drove a baton into the man's thigh, once, clean, enough to make his leg buckle. The man collapsed sideways into his seat, coughing harder, eyes squeezing shut as tears streamed down his face. Someone screamed, a raw, hoarse sound. Then the scream became choking. Mara's hand went to the cockpit door edge, fingers curling around it, knuckles whitening. She didn't step out. She watched, held in place by the same obedience that had brought her thumb down on glass. First officer hand shook her head, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. "You did it," she whispered, voice shredded. "You." Mara couldn't look at her. Her eyes stayed on the aisle, on a uniform pinning the teenager face down across 2 seats, on the mother being pulled apart from her child because her arms were obstructing restraint. The child's small body slipped from her grasp and tumbled sideways, coughing into the cushion, limbs weak. The hoodie man moved closer to Mara as if drawn by her stillness. His voice was soft, almost lost under the cabin chaos. "This is what they wanted," he said. "A human signature. A clean line in a report. Your thumbprint turns brutality into policy." Mara turned on him, sharp enough that the motion felt like breaking ice. "You brought them here?" she hissed. The hoodie man's expression barely changed. "We were brought," he said. "Just like you." Captain Weller made a gurgling sound. Mara snapped her gaze to him. His head had slumped forward, chin pressed to his chest. His lips were tinged blue now. His breathing, What little there had been was gone. For a second, Mara's mind tried to deny it, tried to classify it as unconsciousness, as a medical event that could be reversed if someone acted. Then the uniform voice in the cockpit spoke, calm as ever. Cockpit personnel vital signs indicate failure. Continue protocol. Mara stared at the captain's still body. He's dying, she said, the words flat. Pilot incapacitation anticipated in simulation parameters, the voice replied. Risk mitigation remains optimal. Simulation. The word landed like a slap. Captain Weller wasn't a man to them. He was a data point that had fulfilled its function. First officer hand made a strangled sound, half sob, half growl, and threw herself sideways as far as the zip tie allowed, trying to reach the captain, trying to shake him awake. The restraint bit deeper into her wrists. Blood welled in thin crescents. Mara's body finally moved, not toward the cabin, not toward the captain, but toward the headset hanging limp near the captain's seat. Her hands picked it up with the muscle memory of someone who'd worn one for years. She didn't put it on. She held it, useless like a relic. The retrofit panel's light flickered again, and a new prompt appeared on the tablet, bright and clean. The visor uniform extended the tablet toward her again. Mara looked past it through the windshield at the hangar doors in the distance, already open like a mouth. The aircraft was still on the apron, engines idling low. Outside, more vehicles rolled into position, silent, coordinated, forming a corridor from the plane to the hangars. From the cabin came a new sound, not screaming now, but a heavy, collective coughing that had begun to weaken. Bodies were losing the strength to resist. The system's lullaby voice continued, promising safety to people who could no longer understand language. In the galley, just outside the cockpit door, Jessa lay on her side where they had dragged her, one arm bent wrong beneath her. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. A uniform stepped over her without looking down. Mara's throat tightened until swallowing felt impossible. Her vision tunneled, narrowing to that small body on the floor in a crew uniform identical to hers, except Jessa had believed the uniform meant something. The hoodie man's voice was barely audible now. There, he said. That's the cost of order. The visor uniform didn't wait for Mara to grieve. Confirm, they repeated. Mara stared at the tablet, another glass pad, another place for her thumb. Her fatal flaw rose to meet the moment, not as fear but as a practiced surrender. If she complied, maybe the system would stop escalating. Maybe the corridor to the hangar would stay quiet. Maybe no more batons would crack. Maybe no more bodies would be stepped over, maybe. Mara pressed her thumb down again. The tablet chimed pleasantly. The visor uniform turned away from her immediately, satisfied, already moving to the next step in a process that did not require thanks. The hoodie man watched Mara's face, and for the first time something like pity flickered there. The aircraft began to roll, slow and steady, guided toward the open hangar doors. Mara stood in the cockpit doorway, holding a dead headset in one hand, watching the cabin empty itself of struggle, watching her fellow attendant lie still on the galley floor, watching Captain Weller's body slacken further in his harness. The plane moved forward under her authorization, and behind her, the system's calm voice continued to tell everyone that this was for their safety. The hangar swallowed the aircraft the way deep water swallowed light, quietly, completely, without leaving an edge. As the nose crossed the threshold, floodlights snapped on overhead, white and hard. The sound changed immediately. Outside, wind and distance had softened everything. Inside, every cough from the cabin, every bootstep on the jet bridge stairs, every clink of a buckle became sharp, contained, owned. The hangar doors began to close behind them with a slow hydraulic groan. Mara watched through the windshield as the strip of daylight narrowed to a blade, then to a line, then to nothing. The engine spooled down at a command she hadn't heard. The aircraft shuddered once and fell still. For a moment, the silence felt like mercy, until it filled with movement. The forward door opened again and the restraint team surged in faster now, no longer pretending to be gentle. Shields bumped armrests. Gloved hands grabbed seatbelts and released them, not for comfort but for extraction. The cabin's weak coughing became a low, ragged chorus. Mara stepped out of the cockpit doorway into the galley, and nearly tripped over Jessa's body. Jessa was still on her side, one cheek pressed to the floor, mouth slightly open. Her eyes had gone half-lidded, the whites showing too much. The wrong bent arm remained pinned under her, wrist twisted at an angle that didn't match any human joint. A uniform paused beside her long enough to clip something to Jessa's collar. An adhesive tag that stuck to fabric with a wet sound. The tag displayed a QR code and a single word in small text, CRW. Then the uniform stepped over her again. Mara's hand hovered above Jessa's shoulder. She didn't touch. She couldn't afford to make contact because contact meant ownership, and the system was already assigning ownership with little square labels. The visor uniform with the tablet appeared in the galley like they'd been there all along. They didn't look at Jessa. They held the tablet up in front of Mara's face. "Proceed to debrief," the filtered voice said. "You will comply with narrative containment." Mara's mouth moved, but her voice didn't come. Her throat felt coated in the same sweetness that had filled the cabin, as if the air had crawled inside her and claimed space. Behind the visor, the uniform's eyes were invisible. The authority didn't need eyes, it had cameras. A short corridor had been set up outside the forward door, temporary walls, the black curtains, portable lights. It turned the aircraft exit into a funnel, preventing any stray sightlines. The passengers still on board were being removed through the mid-cabin door on the right side now, where another set of curtains hid the process from Mara's view. All she could see were legs and shoes flashing past gaps, sneakers, loafers, a child's light, upsole blinking weakly with each step as someone carried them. The blazer man's voice rose from somewhere behind the curtains. It was hoarse and thin now. "I want a lawyer," he rasped. A calm voice answered. Not irritated, not threatening. "Counsel access will be provided following medical clearance." Following medical clearance. Not if. When. An order disguised as care. Mara stepped down from the aircraft. Her shoes hit concrete. The hangar smelled of disinfectant and jet fuel, two kinds of sterility layered on top of each other. White lines were painted on the floor in clean grids, like a laboratory. To her right, Captain Weller's body was being removed from the cockpit on a narrow stretcher. A sheet covered him from chest to toes, but his hand had slipped free near the edge, fingers slightly curled, still stained at the corner of the mouth, where the blood had been. A uniform tucked the hand back under the sheet with the same neutral efficiency they'd used to tag Jessa. First officer hand followed, still zip, tied, still upright. Two uniforms held her by the elbows, as if she were a drunk passenger being escorted off a flight, but their grip was firm enough to leave white crescents in her skin. Her eyes found Mara for a brief second as she passed. The look wasn't rage. It was something quieter and worse, a hard accounting. Mara tried to step toward her. A gloved hand touched Mara's upper arm, guiding her away. The touch wasn't violent. It didn't have to be. It told her where she belonged. They moved Mara through the corridor of curtains and into a smaller room carved out of the hangar with temporary walls. It was bright air, conditioned, and empty of anything that looked like comfort. A single chair faced a camera on a tripod. Behind it, a monitor displayed a live feed of Mara's own face, slightly delayed, her expression flattened by the lighting. On the far wall, in neat black lettering, a slogan had been printed directly onto the temporary paneling. The visor unit set the tablet on a small folding table beside the chair. Another uniform, no visor, just a standard mask, placed a bottle of water next to it as if hydration could make what was coming more humane. A third person entered without a uniform. They wore a blazer, clean shoes, a badge clipped high, and their face was uncovered. Their eyes moved over Mara the way a mechanic assessed damage quickly, without apology. "It was Ellery," the person said, voice practiced and warm. "I'm Counsel Lee Eisenhoward. We're going to do a brief statement for record." Mara's lips felt numb. "People are hurt," she said, the words thick. "My captain." Howard nodded sympathetically, already done with the content. "There's a medical team," they replied. "We're working on it. Right now, we need to stabilize public understanding. Your cooperation can reduce secondary harm." Secondary harm. The phrase made the room tilt. Mara stared at the camera. It stared back unblinking. Howard slid a page across the table, not paper, laminated like training materials. At the top was a headline in bold. Mara's eyes scanned the bullet points. Flight experienced maintenance irregularity. Passengers were redirected for safety screening. Crew followed protocol under Aegis guidance. No malicious intent from airline systems. Any unauthorized access was external. Howard's finger tapped the last bullet gently. "We're going to emphasize that," they said. "External actors forced a breach. Your calm response prevented broader tragedy." Mara's gaze lifted slowly. "You want me to say hijackers did it," she said. Howard smiled as if she'd said something naïve but adorable. "It's what the evidence supports," they replied. "And it's what people can understand." The visor uniform shifted behind Howard, subtle as a shadow. The tablet screen lit by itself and displayed a new status. Lime Carbon INDXPNDING. Mara's chest tightened. "Those men in the cockpit," she said. They weren't, they were. Howard's smile stayed fixed. "You were under stress," they said softly. "Your perceptions may not be reliable. That's why we have systems." Mara looked at the laminated statement again. The words were clean. The words would travel well. The words would keep the airline stock steady. The words would make the hangar disappear behind a story the public had seen before: dangerous outsiders, heroic crew, safety restored. She thought of Jess's body on the galley floor, with a QR tag stuck to her uniform. She thought of the child's blinking shoe, carried behind curtains. She thought of Captain Weller's hand being tucked away like an inconvenience. None of it fit inside the statement. Howard leaned closer, lowering their voice as if intimacy made it kinder. "Ms. Ellery, you have a complicated background," they said. "Your service record is admirable. It also means certain misinterpretations can spread quickly if we don't control the narrative." Mara's left shoulder tightened. She heard, suddenly. The past she'd kept buried being unsheathed for public use: combat pilot medals, decorated. The very thing that had made her an asset could make her a villain if the system needed a scapegoat sturdy enough to hold blame. Howard turned the laminated page toward the camera. "We'll film you reading this," they said. "You'll appear steady, credible. Then we can get you through the next steps smoothly." Mara stared at the chair. "Next steps?" she asked. Howard's eyes flicked to the visor uniform, then back. "Temporary custody," they said, still warm. "Standard until the incident is resolved. It's procedural. Procedural. Like everything else. Like her thumb on glass. Like gas in vents. Like tags on bodies." Mara sat in the chair because sitting was what the room was built for. The camera's red light blinked on. Howard stood just out of frame and lifted the laminated statement like a cue card. "Whenever you're ready," they said. Mara looked into the lens. In the monitor, her own face stared back at her, slightly delayed, eyes too wide, lips parted. She could see the uniform collar, the name badge, the harmless image the airline sold. She could also see, if she looked closely, the faint pull at her left shoulder, the place where an old scar lived under fabric, the place that had made people look twice. She began to read. Her voice came out steady. It always did. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, the words hitting the microphone with practiced clarity. "The Y experienced a maintenance irregularity and diverted out of an abundance of caution." Howard's finger moved down the page, guiding her pace. The camera drank every syllable. Mara read about safety screening. She read about following protocol. She read about external actors forcing a breach. Each line felt like setting another tag on another body. Halfway through, her throat tightened again, not from emotion she could name, but from the memory of Jess's nails scraping the cockpit threshold, trying not to be dragged away. Mara's eyes flicked off the card for a fraction of a second. Howard's finger tapped sharply. "Keep going." Mara kept going. When she finished, the camera light clicked off. Howard smiled. "Perfect," they said, and in their tone was relief, not that Mara was okay, but that the system had what it needed. The visor uniform picked up the tablet. The screen updated. Mara sat very still. In the hangar beyond the temporary walls, the muffled sounds continued: doors opening and closing, footsteps in grids, a distant cough that ended in a wet silence. Howard gathered the laminated statement and slid it into a folder like a finished form. "We'll take you to transport," they said. Mara rose because there was no other motion available. As she stepped toward the doorway, she caught one last glimpse of herself in the monitor, uniformed, composed, believable. Outside the room, the corridor of curtains led not back to the aircraft, but toward another set of doors. Through a narrow gap, she saw the hangar floor again, and on it a line of people kneeling with their hands on their heads, wrists bound with zip ties identical to first officer hands. Some wore suits. Some wore hoodies. One small figure in a child's jacket swayed as if falling asleep. Above them, a camera rig tracked the line smoothly, capturing the image from an angle that made it look orderly. Mara's escort tightened their grip on her arm, guiding her toward the doors. She didn't struggle. She didn't shout. She didn't call anyone's name. She walked the way she had always walked when someone in authority told her this was the safest outcome. And somewhere behind the curtains, the story of hijackers began to form, clean, familiar, easy to swallow, while the real flight disappeared into a hangar with no windows. The transport wasn't a police car. It wasn't a military truck. It was a white shuttle van with soft interior lighting and a logo that looked like a healthcare brand. Rounded letters, calm colors, the kind of thing meant to lower blood pressure. Mara was guided into the middle seat of the second row. A seatbelt was buckled across her lap with deliberate care. Two uniforms sat across from her, visors up now, faces ordinary in a way that felt engineered. Another sat behind her, close enough that she could feel their presence like heat. No one said, "under arrest." No one said, "detained." The air was full of euphemisms, temporary custody, debrief, procedural, words that made confinement feel like a service. The van rolled through corridors inside the facility, not on streets. Concrete walls slid past the tinted windows, marked with numbers and arrows like a warehouse. There were no signs for exit. Mara tried to count turns. After the third, she lost track. The route was built to dissolve orientation. When the van stopped, the doors opened onto another interior bay. More curtains. More lights. A different room. This one had a table bolted to the floor and two chairs, one for Mara, one for a person who arrived a moment later carrying a tablet and a file folder like Howard had, but without Howard's warmth. This person wore a plain gray suit and no visible badge. Their hair was neat, their expression blank, their eyes fixed on Mara as if she were a screen that needed calibration. "M's Ellery," they said. "I'm Dr. Sato. Behavioral compliance." Amara sat because sitting was what the room demanded. Sato placed the tablet on the table between them and didn't turn it toward Mara. "We're going to clarify your memory," they said. Mara's tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. "My memory," she repeated. Dr. Sato nodded once. "Stress produces distortions," they said. "Your statement will be used publicly. Your internal recollection must align with it. Align. Not heal, not understand. Align." Mara's hands rested on her knees, fingers curled. She stared at the edge of the table, where someone had etched a small scratch, maybe a previous person's attempt to leave evidence that they had been here. "I saw what happened," Mara said. Sato's eyes didn't change. "You experienced a maintenance irregularity and a security breach caused by external actors," they replied. "You complied with protocol. The system prevented a broader tragedy." Mara swallowed, the motion loud in the quiet room. "The system caused it." "Doctor." Sato tapped the tablet once. A small chime sounded, pleasant, like a notification from a shopping app. "We'll begin with the cockpit," they said. What time did you first observe the breach attempt?" Mara tried to anchor herself. Time, sequence, facts. It was how she had survived investigations before, military debriefs where everything was measured, everything was justified. But those rooms had at least pretended to care whether the truth matched the numbers. This room didn't pretend. "I didn't observe a breach attempt." Mara said, "I heard impacts." Then Dr. Sato lifted a hand, palm out, not a stop, a gentle pause. "You observed external actors attempting to access the cockpit." They corrected. "The record shows that." Mara's eyes flicked up. "The record?" she repeated. Dr. Sato nodded. "We have video," they said. "Audio. Telemetry." Biometric data. Your subjective experience is secondary. Mara felt something shift in her chest. Not emotion, not panic, but the cold realization that her own senses were not admissible. The system had already decided what she had seen. Dr. Sato continued, voice even. You will be asked to confirm each segment. When your recollection diverges, we will provide corrective framing. This is for your protection. Protection. The same word Aegis had used while filling lungs with sweetness. Mara's jaw tightened. And if I don't? Sato's eyes finally moved, just slightly, to something off to the side. Mara followed the glance and saw, through a small window in the temporary wall, another room. Inside it, blurred by glass, a figure sat hunched in a chair. Jessa. Her hair was loose now, her uniform unbuttoned at the collar. A rigid brace wrapped her left arm. Her head hung forward, chin to chest, as if she were asleep or trying to disappear into her own body. A uniform stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the same gentle pressure Mara had seen at the cockpit door. Mara's throat tightened so hard it felt like her airway narrowed. Dr. Sato watched Mara watching Jessa. Compliance reduces collateral damage, they said. Collateral. The word had followed Mara across years and uniforms like a shadow. She had tried to outgrow it. Now it sat on the table between them. Mara's voice came out thin. What did you do to her? Dr. Sato's expression didn't change. She is being medically stabilized and prepared for narrative alignment, they said. Her cooperation index is low. The tablet chimed again. Doctor. Sato slid a thin sheet across the table. Not laminated this time, paper. At the top, Koprayon a Gurayamat. Below it, lines of text in dense legal language. Her name, her flight number, a clause about non-disclosure, a clause about voluntary participation, a clause about indemnifying the airline and its partners, a clause about psychological support offered contingent on compliance. At the bottom, a blank signature line. Mara stared at it. The pen beside it was placed with the same careful efficiency as the water bottle had been. Dr. Sato spoke softly now, as if kindness could be manufactured by volume. You are a decorated combat pilot, they said. The public will trust you. The public will believe you. That is why you were on that aircraft. Mara's hands clenched. I was a flight attendant. Dr. Sato's head tilted. You are what the system requires, they said. The hijackers took over the flight. Mara's stomach turned at the phrase, hearing it in someone else's mouth like a slogan. And the flight attendant, Dr. Sato continued, was a decorated combat pilot. It will be a story about bravery under pressure, a story that stabilizes confidence. Mara stared at the signature line. The title wasn't decorative here. It was architecture. It was a frame that would make everything else fit. She thought of the hoodie man calling her a blessing stamp. She thought of Captain Weller's warning, you become the story. She thought of the system's calm voice, a safest outcome requires order. Mara reached for the pen. Her fingers wrapped around it and her hand trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of repetition. Thumb on glass, signature on paper, the same motion in different formats. Through the small window, Jessa lifted her head slightly, as if sensing movement. Her eyes found Mara's through the glass, unfocused at first, then sharpening. Mara saw the bruise blooming at Jessa's temple, where her head had struck the doorframe. She saw the hollow of her cheeks, the way her lips had cracked. Jessa's mouth moved, forming a word without sound. Mara couldn't read it at first. Then Jessa mouthed it again, slower. Don't. Mara's hand tightened around the pen. Dr. Sato's voice stayed calm. Sign, they said. Then you can go home. A home. Another euphemism. Another corridor. Mara looked at the paper again and saw, beneath the language, the true function: convert violence into agreement, convert coercion into consent, convert a woman's obedience into proof that the system had worked. She lowered the pen tip toward the line. And then, without lifting her gaze from the paper, she said, quietly, no. The room didn't react like a room in a movie. No alarms, no shouting. Just a pause, the kind you hear in a call center when the script doesn't have a branch for what you said. Dr. Sato stared at Mara. Then they tapped the tablet once. A tone sounded somewhere outside the room. Through the window, The uniform behind Jessa shifted their grip on her shoulder. Jessa flinched, shoulders hunching as if bracing for pain that wasn't visible. Mara's breath caught. Dr. Sato's voice remained even. Your cooperation index is dropping, they said. Your refusal increases collateral exposure. Mara's mouth went dry. She stared at Jessa's hunched form through the glass and felt the system tighten around both of them like a net drawn closed. Doctor, Sato slid the paper closer again, aligning it precisely with the table's edge. You don't need to be heroic, they said. You only need to be consistent. Consistent. That was the system's word for obedience that didn't break. Mara lifted the pen again. Not to sign. To move it, slowly, toward the paper's upper corner where the agreement's title was printed. Her hand shook once, then steadied. She drew a single line through the header. Not enough to destroy it. Enough to mark it as contested. Dr. Sato watched the ink appear, their face unreadable. That changes nothing, they said. Mara didn't answer. She drew another line heavier, crossing the first. A crude X, a visible refusal. The uniform behind her shifted. She felt their presence press closer. Dr. Sato's voice lost a fraction of warmth. Ellery, they said. Do you understand what happens to assets that resist alignment? Assets. Mara's stomach turned again. She looked at Jessa through the glass and saw the uniform's hand still on her shoulder, gentle as a leash. Mara's own fatal flaw, obedience, rose, demanding she fix it, comply, stop the harm. But something else rose with it now, the ugly, belated understanding that her obedience had been the harm's engine. She set the pen down. I understand, she said. Dr. Sato tapped the tablet again, and the room's lights flickered once, like a system rebooting. Somewhere beyond the walls, a door opened. Mara heard footsteps, more than two, approaching. Through the window, Jess's eyes widened, and this time she didn't mouth, don't. She mouthed something else, something smaller, almost apologetic. I'm sorry. Mara sat in the chair, hands flat on her knees, and waited as the system arrived to correct her. The footsteps stopped outside the room, and for a moment the silence pressed in so hard Mara could hear her own pulse in her ears. Then the door opened, and the people who came in didn't look like security. They wore scrubs. Clean, light-colored, with badges clipped high and shoes that made almost no sound on the concrete floor. Their faces were uncovered, their expressions neutral, their hands empty except for a small case the lead nurse carried like a lunchbox. Behind them, a uniformed guard lingered in the doorway, not entering, just present, an anchor of authority behind the illusion of care. Dr. Sato didn't stand. They didn't greet them. They simply slid the cooperation agreement off the table and tucked it into their folder, as if removing a failed attempt at persuasion. Non-alignment, Dr. Sato said, not to Mara but to the nurse. Initiate stabilization. The nurse nodded like this was a routine order. Mara's mouth opened. What? She began, but the word died in her throat when one of the scrubs stepped behind her chair and placed 2 fingers lightly on her shoulder, the same gentle pressure she'd seen on Jessa. The touch wasn't forceful. It was a signal we don't need to fight you. We only need you to stop moving. The lead nurse opened the case and removed a syringe already filled, capped, ready. They didn't brandish it. They held it with the bored competence of someone who'd given 1,000 vaccinations. This is for anxiety, the nurse said softly, as if labeling it made it benign. Mara laughed once, no humor in it, just air forced out. It's for compliance. The nurse's eyes didn't change. It will help you rest, they said. Dr. Sato watched the exchange like a scientist watching an animal resist a cage. You have been under significant stress, they said. Rest will improve your recollection. Mara's fingers dug into her knees, nails biting through fabric. The old reflex screamed at her to cooperate. Keep the room calm, keep the situation controllable, keep yourself alive. But she pictured Captain Weller's blue, tinned lips. Jessa dragged backward, head cracking on metal. 47 people choking in their seats under a voice promising safety. Her thumb on the glass. Her voice came out rough. If you drug me, you can say anything I remember. Dr. Sato nodded. We can say it regardless, they replied. This is simply cleaner. The nurse stepped closer. syringe angled toward Mara's upper arm. The scrub behind her tightened their fingers on her shoulder by a millimeter, anticipating the flinch. Mara didn't flinch. She let her body go still, not in surrender, but in calculation. She had flown through flak by going still, letting the aircraft do what it was built to do. This room was built to stabilize her. She needed one movement it wasn't designed to predict. Her eyes flicked to the tablet on the table. It sat within reach, its screen dark now, but Mara knew it was always listening. Always logging. "White," Mara said, and forced her voice into the same calm cadence she'd used on passengers. "If I cooperate, if I align, can I see Jessa?" Sato studied her, measuring whether the question was genuine or tactical. Mara held their gaze, letting her face go blank, the way she'd learned to do when superiors looked for cracks. Dr. Sato nodded slowly. "If you return to alignment," they said, "you will be permitted a controlled interaction. It will support her stabilization." Mara's throat tightened. Controlled interaction. A privilege disguised as therapy. She let out a small breath, the kind of sigh people made when they gave in. "Okay," she said. The nurse's posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. The syringe remained poised, but the room's tension shifted. Sato slid the cooperation agreement back onto the table, straightening it with 2 precise taps. "Sign," they said. Mara reached for the pen. Her hand shook just enough to look real. She lowered the pen tip to the paper and drew her signature the way she'd signed thousands of routine forms. Fast, practiced, legible enough to be binding. The ink dried instantly, black and permanent. Dr. Sato watched without satisfaction. "Thank you," they said, as if gratitude mattered. The nurse capped the syringe and returned it to the case, a disappointed motion like a tool being put away unused. The tablet chimed softly on the table, waking. The screen lit. Mara stared at the words until they might as well have been carved into her skin. "Doctor." Sato rose for the first time. "We'll proceed," they said. They nodded to the scrubs. "Bring her." The guard at the door stepped aside, and the room's occupants flowed outward into the corridor of fluorescent light. Mara walked between them, not held, not pushed, just guided by the same gentle touches that made resistance unnecessary. They passed other temporary rooms, other curtained spaces. Through gaps she glimpsed fragments. An older woman in an airport sweater staring blankly at a wall, a man with a bloody nose seated under a camera, a child asleep on a gurney with an oxygen mask, one light-up shoe still blinking faintly at the end of the bed. Each image looked cleanly arranged, like evidence laid out for a story someone would tell later. They led Mara to a door marked Medical, STAFONY. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and warm plastic. The lighting softened, deliberately less harsh. The kind of place meant to mimic care. Rows of curtained bays lined the room, each with a bed, a monitor, a camera in the corner. Dr. Sato stopped at one bay and pulled the curtain aside. Jessa lay on the bed, arm in a brace, hair tangled across the pillow. An IV line ran into her hand, her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling as if it were too bright to look away from. A monitor beeped steadily beside her. Comforting sound, clinical rhythm. When Jessa saw Mara, she tried to sit up. Pain flashed through her face in a small tightening around the mouth, and she stopped, swallowing it back down. "Mara?" she whispered. Mara stepped closer. The nurse and Dr. Sato stayed just outside the curtain, visible in the gap, watching. "You're alive," Mara said, and hated how small the sentence sounded. Jessa's eyes flicked to the gap in the curtain. "They told me," she whispered. "They told me you saved everyone." Mara's throat tightened hard. She began. Jessa's gaze stayed fixed on Mara's face, searching, desperate for the story that would make the pain make sense. "They said you were trained," she whispered. "That you knew what to do." Mara stood at the side of the bed, hands hovering uselessly over the blanket. The system was watching. The system wanted this moment to confirm its narrative, a traumatized crew member reassured by the hero in uniform. A clean emotional resolution that would make future compliance easier. Mara leaned down slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, softly enough that the microphones might miss it. Jessa blinked, confusion flickering. "Why are you?" Mara glanced at the monitor beside Jessa's bed. On its black bezel, A tiny lens stared out. Another camera in the corner. 2 eyes at least, probably more hidden in vents and panels. Everything here was recorded, processed, used. Jessa followed Mara's glance and went still. Her lips parted, then closed again as understanding settled in, not full but enough. "They're gonna make me say it," Jessa whispered. Mara didn't answer. Her silence was the only honest thing she could offer without giving the system words to weaponize. Jessa's hand moved weakly across the blanket toward Mara's, fingers trembling. Mara hesitated, then let her fingertips touch Jessa's. The contact was light, barely there, but it felt like a confession. Jessa's grip tightened suddenly, surprising strength and pain. "Mara," she whispered, urgent. "Fat boy, row 16. He was coughing so bad. They took him after the gas." I heard them say. A shadow passed over the curtain gap. Dr. Sato's voice cut in gently. "Time." Jessa flinched and released Mara's fingers, snapping her hand back as if burned. Mara straightened. Her eyes met Dr. Sato's through the gap. Their face remained neutral, but their gaze held a warning: don't contaminate the narrative. Mara looked back at Jessa. Jessa's eyes had gone wet, but she didn't cry. She stared at Mara like someone memorizing a face they might not see again. Mara leaned down once more, close enough that her hair brushed Jessa's pillow. "When they ask you," Mara whispered, read their words. "But remember yours?" Jessa's breath caught. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes for a long second, as if storing the sentence somewhere safer than sound. Dr. Sato pulled the curtain back. The moment ended, clipped cleanly like an edited video. They escorted Mara out of medical and down another corridor into a room that looked more permanent than the others. Concrete walls, a single bed bolted to the floor, a toilet with no lid, a camera in the ceiling corner. "Temporary housing?" Dr. Sato said, "until the investigation concludes." Mara stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft magnetic click. On the bed lay a folded set of clothes, not her uniform. Plain gray sweatpants and a sweatshirt, each stamped with a small shield in circle emblem. Mara stared at them. A new uniform. A new role. The ceiling camera's red LED blinked steadily. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, and listened as the facility's sounds filtered through the walls. Distant footsteps, a muffled cough, a door closing far away. Her cooperation agreement had been signed. Her statement had been recorded. Her thumbprints were logged. The system had what it needed. And Mara, alone under the camera's eye, realized the final cruelty wasn't that she'd been forced to comply. It was that she'd been given just enough choice to make the compliance hers. The gray sweatshirt smelled like industrial detergent and nothing else. No softness, no human trace. When Mara pulled it over her head, the fabric caught briefly on her left shoulder, on the scar under the skin, and she hissed in a breath that didn't become sound. The shield emblem sat centered on her chest like an accusation. She sat back on the bolted bed and stared at the ceiling camera until her eyes blurred. The red LED blinked in steady rhythm, a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. Somewhere in the facility, an air handler hummed, pushing sanitized air through vents that might also be listening. Minutes passed, or hours. In places like this, time wasn't a sequence. It was a tool. A slot in the door clicked open once, and a tray slid in, food arranged neatly, untouched by hands. Plastic utensils, a paper cup of water, a small card beside it that read, "Tiashio fario operation." Mara stared at the card until the words lost meaning. She didn't eat. Later. She knew it was later only because the air in the room cooled slightly. The door opened. 2 uniforms stood in the frame, visors up, faces blank and tired. Behind them, Dr. Sato waited with the tablet. "M's Ellery," Dr. Sato said. "You will participate in a follow-up recording." Mara stood. The motion felt automatic now, her body responding to the cadence of instruction the way it always had. They led her through corridors that looked identical to each other, concrete, fluorescent, numbered doors. Occasionally, she passed a small window in a wall and saw glimpses of other rooms, people in gray sweatsuits like hers, sitting under cameras, speaking to tablets, eyes glassy. In one window, she saw the Blazer Man. His nose was swollen, dried blood streaking his upper lip. A laminated statement sat on a table in front of him. He stared at it the way Mara had stared at hers, and his hands shook as he lifted a pen. In another window, she saw a teenage boy, head bent, coughing weakly into his elbow. A nurse adjusted an oxygen mask and then stepped away, leaving him alone under a camera. Mara's chest tightened. She didn't stop walking. The follow-up room was different from the first. This one had a backdrop, flat blue, the kind used for corporate apologies, and a chair positioned precisely under a soft light that made faces look warmer. On the wall behind the camera, a small monitor displayed headlines already drafted in neat fonts. Mara stared at the words and felt her stomach twist. The story was already moving without her, a river that didn't care who drowned under its surface. Dr. Sato gestured to the chair. "Sit," they said. Mara sat. The camera's red light blinked on. This time Howard was there too, standing just out of frame, holding a new laminated card. Their smile was smaller now, more professional than warm. "We're going to address misinformation," Howard said. "There are rumors circulating online." Mara didn't speak. Her throat felt tight, as if the facility air had dried her from the inside. Howard's finger tapped the laminated card. "Simple," they said. "You reassure the public. You emphasize that passengers were treated respectfully. You emphasize that all medical interventions were necessary." Mara's eyes flicked to Dr. Sato. "And the people who were taken?" she asked. Sato's expression remained neutral. "They are being processed," they said. "Some will be released when risk scores normalize. Some, and the others?" Mara asked. Howard's smile held. "We don't speculate," they said. "We keep focus on safety." Safety again. The word that meant the system survived. Mara stared into the camera lens. In the monitor, her face appeared framed, softened, credible. The sweatshirt's emblem was visible. The system had dressed her for this too. Howard held the card up. "Whenever you're ready." Mara began to read. "My name is Mara Ellery," she said, voice steady, the old training rising like a shield. "I want to thank the security personnel who responded quickly and professionally." She spoke about respect. She spoke about medical necessity. She spoke about external hijackers. She spoke about how Aegis prevented a broader tragedy. Every sentence felt like a small betrayal of the coughing boy behind glass, of the blazer man signing under a camera, of Jess's cracked lips forming silent apologies. Halfway through, Howard's finger paused on a line, and Mara saw the next words before she said them. "I am proud to have served my country," the line read, "and proud to have served the passengers of Flight 702, proud." Mara's eyes lifted from the card to the camera. She felt her jaw clench. She thought of the red oak cross medals in a box somewhere, tucked away like shame. She thought of the people she'd once called targets. She thought of Captain Weller's hand being tucked under a sheet. Her voice came out anyway. "I am proud," she began. The word stuck in her teeth. A small sound escaped her, air against tight throat, not quite a cough. Howard's smile tightened. "Keep going," they whispered. Mara finished the line. The camera captured it cleanly. When the recording ended, the camera light clicked off. Howard exhaled with visible relief. "Great," they said, as if this were a performance review. Dr. Sato tapped the tablet. A new line appeared on the screen, and Mara saw it reflected faintly in Dr. Sato's glasses. They walked her back through the corridors. On the way, they passed a doorway that stood ajar. Inside, a table was set with 2 chairs, and on the wall behind it, a large screen displayed a live feed from a news channel. Mara caught a glimpse as she walked past. A breaking news banner, her own recorded statement playing, her face framed in soft light. Below it, a pundit nodded solemnly. And of course, the pundit was saying, "It's reassuring to know the crew included a decorated combat pilot. That kind of discipline under pressure is exactly what we need in these uncertain times." Mara kept walking. Back in her cell room, the door closed with the soft magnetic click. A few minutes later, the facility's internal speaker crackled once. A voice, calm, genderless, familiar, filled the room. "Thank you for supporting flight integrity," it said. "Your compliance has reduced overall harm." Mara's stomach turned. The voice continued. "Please prepare for reintegration." The reintegration. The word sounded like release, like freedom. It was neither. The next morning, if it was morning, the lights never changed, they brought her a new set of clothes. Not gray sweats. A civilian outfit, jeans, a plain sweater, a coat. Her flight attendant uniform was gone. Howard appeared again, smiling gently, holding a small folder. "You're being released," they said. "You'll return home. You'll be on administrative leave with full pay. We'll handle media requests. You'll be a symbol of resilience." Mara stared at the folder. "What about Jessa?" she asked. Howard's smile didn't flicker. "She's receiving care," they said. "She'll be fine." Mara didn't believe it. But belief wasn't a currency here. They drove her, not in the white van this time, but in a standard ride-share, looking sudden, through a service tunnel, then out into daylight that felt too wide. The facility fence line vanished behind trees and earth berms designed to hide it from roads. An hour later, Mara was standing outside her apartment building in a normal city, under a normal sky, holding a small paper bag with her belongings. Her phone had been returned, wiped clean, no photos, no messages newer than the morning of the flight. Her bank app showed a deposit labeled Commission Beau US. A neighbor walked past with groceries and nodded politely, not recognizing her yet. Inside her apartment, the air smelled like dust and forgotten coffee. Everything sat exactly as she'd left it, a dish in the sink, a jacket on the chair, a stack of mail. It felt wrong, like a set rebuilt after a fire. Her television turned on by itself. The volume was low, but the image was unmistakable. Her face, again, delivering her calm statement. A banner scrolling beneath it. A news anchor spoke over the footage. While details remain classified, officials confirm that the hijackers have been apprehended. The airline praised Aegis flight integrity and the crew's composure. Hijackers apprehended. The words landed like a final lock. Mara turned off the TV. The silence in the apartment felt heavier than the facilities. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature. Mara's fingers hovered over the screen. She didn't type. She didn't delete. She set the phone down on the counter and stared at it like it might bite. In the bathroom, she washed her hands until the skin reddened. The water ran clear. It didn't matter. When she looked up into the mirror, she saw her own face, tired, pale, ordinary. No uniform, no badge, no emblem. But her left shoulder still pulled slightly, the scar still there, the body remembering what the story tried to rewrite. She opened the medicine cabinet and saw, among old prescriptions, a small new bottle she hadn't bought. No label, just a white cap. Mara froze. Her reflection stared back, eyes widening slowly. Not fear exactly, recognition. The system hadn't just released her. It had installed itself in her home. Her phone buzzed again, this time. Not a message, but a notification from an app she didn't remember downloading. Agis de mess, CCCK Pelies Kof Armo We Are Safe. A button beneath it, Kafaya Arm. Mara stared at the screen, thumb hovering above it the way it had hovered above the tablet in the cockpit. The same motion, the same trap. A small voluntary action that would become a record. From her open window, she heard distant city sounds. Traffic, a dog barking, someone laughing on the sidewalk. Life continuing, unaware of the hangar with no windows. Mara lowered her thumb, not to press confirm. To turn the phone over so the screen went dark. She sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, phone face down on the tile, and listened to the faint buzz as it continued vibrating with unanswered requests. Outside, somewhere in the city, people watched her statement and felt reassured. Inside, Mara watched the label, less bottle, and understood the title's true weight, not as a twist, but as a sentence. Hijackers took over the flight, and the flight attendant was a decorated combat pilot, because when the system needed violence to look like safety, it dressed a weapon in a smile and called it service. She stayed there until the buzzing stopped, and when it did, the silence felt like the last part of the procedure. If this story stayed with you, if it left a quiet weight behind your ribs, thank you for staying until the end. Consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who sits with these kinds of questions. And if you want more stories where the hardest choices are the ones that look most reasonable, come back for the next one.